He struck her, thinking no one would see. But in the shadows stood someone who doesn't forgive injustice. Subscribe so you don't miss the next stories, and write in the comments where you're watching from. The warm glow of early evening filtered through the windshield as Lisa Hunt drove slowly down the familiar streets that led to her quiet suburban neighborhood. Her hands rested on the steering wheel, steady but tense, her breath shallow as her eyes flicked occasionally to the rearview mirror. The day had been long, too long for someone in her condition, but she was determined to finish it on her own terms. She had stopped by the grocery store after her final prenatal appointment, picking up a few things for dinner. Her husband, out of town for a 3-day conference, had offered to hire a driver for her, but Lisa had declined. She needed the movement. She needed the sense of normalcy. Her pregnancy, now well into the 3rd trimester, came with the usual discomforts: aches, swollen ankles, sleepless nights. But tonight, for a fleeting moment, she felt something like peace. The baby had been active earlier, but now seemed to settle, lulled by the gentle motion of the car. Lisa smiled to herself, one hand slipping briefly to her belly. Almost home, she thought. Just another 10 minutes. The streets were quiet, lined with parked cars and trimmed hedges, a picturesque snapshot of suburban calm. She passed the same mailboxes, the same tall trees that cast long shadows across the pavement. The sun had just begun its slow descent behind the rooftops. The air was still, the kind of hush that preceded nightfall in neighborhoods like this. Then, without warning, red and blue lights exploded behind her. Her heart seized. The rearview mirror lit up with flashing colors. A patrol car. Lisa's mind snapped alert, adrenaline spiking as her fingers tightened around the wheel. She blinked, disbelieving, and instinctively let her foot ease off the accelerator. She hadn't been speeding. Her turn signal had been on. She had stopped completely at the last intersection. She remembered checking her mirrors. Everything had been by the book. She blinked again. The patrol car wasn't just behind her, it was tailing her aggressively. The flashing lights weren't for someone else, they were for her. Lisa's breath caught in her throat. Her first thought was to pull over, and she did, carefully, with a practiced calm that barely masked the unease building in her chest. She signaled, eased to the curb, and shifted the gear into park. Her heart thundered now, a deep, rolling drumbeat in her chest. This couldn't be real. What had she done? The familiar advice played in her mind like a recording. Stay calm, keep your hands visible, don't argue, don't reach unless asked. She sat still, hands on the wheel, waiting. The lights behind her kept flashing, casting jarring reflections across her dashboard. Through the mirror, she saw the door of the patrol car open and the officer step out. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a brisk, almost predatory gait. His expression was unreadable beneath the shade of his cap. He approached slowly, deliberately, his boots tapping rhythmically against the pavement. Lisa felt her stomach churn. There was something in the way he moved. Not haste, not concern, but an almost theatrical performance of control. Power. As he came closer, her vision narrowed, her field of focus closing in on the man now towering beside her window. He didn't greet her, he didn't explain, he just motioned with a jerk of his head and a single clipped command. Step out of the vehicle. Lisa hesitated. Officer, she began, her voice careful, controlled. Can I ask what? I said out, now. His tone left no room for negotiation. Her hands instinctively went to unbuckle her seatbelt, every movement slow, measured. She felt the baby shift slightly inside her, a dull throb low in her abdomen reminding her how vulnerable she was. She opened the door carefully, using it to brace herself as she stepped out. The sidewalk felt uneven beneath her feet. Her balance, never strong these days, faltered slightly as she straightened up. The officer stood less than 2 feet from her, his body language invasive, confrontational. His nameplate read Barnes, but it was his eyes that struck her most. Cold, impersonal, as if she were not a woman, not pregnant, not a person, just a problem to be handled. Lisa tried to keep her breathing even. "I'm pregnant," she said, voice low. "I need to move carefully." He didn't respond. Without warning, Barnes reached out and grabbed her arm. Tight, too tight. The force of the gesture startled her. She stumbled sideways as he yanked her away from the open car door. "Hey, please," she gasped. But her plea hung in the air, ignored. He spun her, his grip now on her shoulder, forcing her around as if expecting resistance that never came. Her feet slid on the pavement as she struggled to keep up, her balance off. She flinched, her free hand clutching her belly protectively. Barnes muttered something under his breath, and in the next breath, without warning, his fist came down, low, sharp, and fast, into her stomach. The world exploded in white noise. Pain radiated from the center of her abdomen outward, spreading like fire. Her legs buckled beneath her, and she crumpled to the ground with a soundless scream. The wind had been knocked from her, her vision blurred. Time slowed. She didn't move. She couldn't. Her arms wrapped around her belly, instinctively protecting, shielding. She didn't know if she could scream. Her jaw was open, but her voice had vanished. The world narrowed to the sound of her heartbeat in her ears and the echo of impact still reverberating through her body. She heard his boots shift. He was standing over her, silent. For a terrifying moment, she thought he might strike again. She squeezed her eyes shut, praying for the strength to hold still, to keep breathing, to survive this. Then, somewhere behind them, a voice called out. Not loud, not panicked, but clear. She couldn't turn her head to see. The sound of another set of footsteps broke the rhythm. These weren't heavy, like Barnes. They were purposeful, steady, but lighter, more controlled. Barnes turned. His boots scraped against the concrete as he stepped away. Lisa didn't open her eyes. She heard only pieces of the confrontation. Low, male voices, one of them rising, the other calm. The sounds stopped. When she opened her eyes, Barnes was on the ground, flat on his back. And standing over him, quietly catching his breath, was a man Lisa didn't recognize. He looked down at the officer for a moment, then turned his attention to her. He crouched beside her, his hands not reaching for her but ready in case she needed help. His voice was calm, reassuring, not urgent, but aware. She blinked up at him, her body trembling. Just before the distant wail of sirens reached her ears, she exhaled for the first time in minutes. She was still alive. The baby? She didn't know yet. But something, someone, had stopped the worst from happening. She didn't know the man's name. Not yet. But in that moment, as the flashing lights of oncoming cars cut through the night, Lisa realized her story had changed. This wasn't going to end on a quiet street, alone in the dark. Not now. Not anymore. The sirens grew louder, wailing in the distance like the call of some spectral creature echoing through the city streets. The darkness around Lisa thickened. Not just the absence of sunlight, but something weightier. An atmosphere of fear and shock that had settled into her bones. Her body lay crumpled on the pavement, one side of her cheek pressed to the cold concrete, her arms protectively wrapped around her stomach as though sheer will alone could protect the life inside her. Her breath came in shallow gasps, each inhale a battle, each exhale a whisper of disbelief. Pain pulsed through her abdomen in sickening waves, hot and sharp, radiating from the spot where the officer's fist had landed. She tried to open her eyes fully, but the world swam, disoriented and unfocused. The streetlights overhead blurred into a halo. The muffled thud of footsteps and indistinct voices circled her, but her senses could barely piece the world back together. For a moment, there was only the sound of her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. But then, one voice rose above the noise. It wasn't loud or commanding. It was steady, calm, almost unnervingly so, given the chaos surrounding them. It cut through the night like a blade through silk, not sharp with anger, but edged with unmistakable certainty. Lisa forced her eyes open. The first thing she saw was Officer Barnes on the ground. He was no longer looming over her, no longer the source of danger. He was flat on his back, limbs sprawled, struggling to lift himself even partially. His breath came in ragged bursts, his eyes wide, confused and furious. There was something deeply disoriented in his expression, as though he hadn't yet accepted what had happened. Standing a short distance away, backlit by the flickering headlights and casting a long shadow, was the man who had intervened. He stood with a natural stillness, neither aggressive nor defensive, simply watchful. His stance wasn't theatrical or exaggerated. He wasn't posing for effect or attention. His fists were relaxed at his sides, breathing even, shoulders squared not in bravado but balance. He wasn't a uniformed officer. He wasn't carrying a badge or gun. His clothing was unremarkable. Jeans, boots, a dark jacket zipped halfway up. His face, however, carried a certain familiarity, though Lisa's dazed mind couldn't yet place it. He had the kind of presence that made people instinctively take a step back, not because of fear, but because of something else. Authority, maybe, or something earned. The man turned slightly and walked toward her, not in a rush, but with a pace that suggested confidence and clarity. He crouched beside her, his knees cracking slightly as he settled close but not too close, keeping a respectful distance. "You're safe now," he said softly. Lisa's lips parted, but the words didn't come. She was too shaken to speak. Her eyes flickered to his, trying to read the depth of his intentions, but found nothing threatening there, only quiet concern. He didn't reach out to touch her. Instead, his eyes moved to her abdomen, where her hands still gripped her belly, then back to her face. He gave a small, slow nod, as if reassuring her again, without asking for anything in return. Behind him, Barnes groaned. The officer tried to push himself up, clutching his side. His breathing was uneven now, the wind knocked out of him, but anger still burned behind his eyes. He wasn't used to being stopped, certainly not like this. Lisa caught fragments of what followed. A few bystanders, drawn by the flashing lights, had approached cautiously from the sidewalk. One of them, a young man with a phone raised, was already recording. Another shouted that the police were on their way, unaware they had been the ones to call them in the first place. Somewhere, another neighbor emerged from a front door, cell phone in hand, speaking urgently into the receiver. The residential street, moments ago empty and silent, had become a stage. The man beside Lisa turned and stood with a fluid motion. His face was still calm, his posture neutral. But there was no doubt who had control of the moment now. Barnes was trying to get to his knees. "Stay down," someone barked. Not the man, but one of the newly arrived neighbors. There was fear in the voice, Maybe disbelief, but no sympathy. Lisa closed her eyes again. Her limbs felt heavy, each muscle aching with dull resistance. Her mind couldn't keep up with the speed at which everything had turned. The baby. She needed to know the baby was okay. That thought pressed to the front of her mind like a burning flame. Was there movement? Had she felt a kick since the attack? Her arms tightened protectively, panic rising again. A hand gently touched her shoulder. She flinched, but it wasn't rough. It wasn't demanding. It was the man, the stranger. His touch, barely there, meant only to ground her. "You're going to be all right," he said, more quietly now. For the first time since the attack, she believed it. The flashing lights multiplied, dancing now across the rooftops and the hoods of parked cars as two squad cars pulled onto the street. Doors opened and officers stepped out. There was movement, orders being given, voices clashing and separating as the scene unfolded with confusing speed. Lisa couldn't track all of it. She heard the sound of handcuffs snapping shut, heard someone say the name Barnes, heard a raised voice arguing, then silence. Medics arrived shortly after. Their flashlights were blinding, their hands efficient and firm as they moved around her, checked her vitals, asked questions. Lisa could barely answer. Someone mentioned internal trauma. A backboard was brought out. She protested weakly, saying she didn't want to lie flat, not like that, but they reassured her. It was precautionary. As they worked, one of the officers approached the man who had intervened. "We need your statement," the officer said. The man nodded once. "Of course." He stepped aside, speaking in low tones. Lisa couldn't hear the words, but she could see the body language, the lack of aggression, the mutual understanding between the officer and this quiet stranger. No argument, no resistance, just facts, calmly delivered. They loaded her into the ambulance. One of the medics asked for her name again. Her fingers trembled as she spelled it. Lisa Hunt, 31 years old, 34 weeks pregnant. No history of complications, she said. No recent pain. No high blood pressure. She kept her eyes shut most of the ride, trying to focus on the rhythm of the road, the soft murmur of voices, the faint beeping of the heart monitor beside her. She thought again about the man. His face had become clearer in her mind now. She had recognized him. Not in the way you recognize a friend or neighbor, but in the way a face from a different world lingers in your memory. His name surfaced slowly, like a bubble rising through water. Chuck Norris. The name alone would have seemed absurd if not for the reality of what had just unfolded. She wasn't a fan of celebrity culture. She didn't follow tabloids or action films, but even she knew his reputation, more myth than man in most circles. And yet, there he had been, stepping in not as a larger-than-life figure, but as a quiet presence who saw injustice and stopped it. It didn't feel like a scene from a movie. It felt real, stark and raw and terrifying. The hospital came into view, fluorescent lights gleaming through the ambulance windows. The medics prepped her for immediate examination. She felt the gurney wheels beneath her as they rolled her through sliding doors, past rushed footsteps and murmured voices. Nurses called out orders. A doctor introduced himself. They asked about the impact, where it had landed, how strong, how quickly she had fallen. She answered as best she could, her mind trailing off with each sentence. The baby. That was the question that mattered most. They took her into a private room, hooked her up to machines. An ultrasound tech arrived, placing cold gel on her abdomen, moving the probe slowly, carefully. The screen flickered, and then, there it was. A heartbeat. Fast, rhythmic, steady. The sound filled the room. Relief broke over her like a wave. Tears welled in her eyes, spilling down her cheeks silently. She closed her eyes and let herself feel it. Feel everything. The fear, the pain, the rage, and now, finally, the overwhelming gratitude. Her baby was alive. That was all that mattered. The doctor told her she'd need to stay overnight for monitoring. The trauma alone warranted observation, and they wanted to rule out placental damage. She nodded wordlessly. They offered pain medication, but she declined. She wanted to stay clear, to remember. An officer came by hours later to take her statement. She recounted everything, detail by painful detail. The stop, the tone, the touch, the fist, the fall, and the stranger who had saved her. When she finished, she lay back against the pillows, exhausted. The monitors beeped steadily beside her. The room was quiet again, like the street had been before the lights. But it wasn't the same silence. This one was heavier, but it was also safe. And somewhere, she knew, the man who had stepped out of the shadows, who had brought her back from the edge, was still out there. Not waiting for recognition, not expecting praise. Just doing what needed to be done. The kind of person the world rarely noticed until they had no choice. The beeping of the heart monitor was the first thing Lisa registered when she drifted back to awareness. The rhythmic, steady sound filled the hospital room, blending with the quiet murmur of voices from the hallway beyond. Her body felt heavy, her limbs weighted down by exhaustion, but she was awake. Slowly, she blinked her eyes open, the fluorescent lighting above too harsh, too bright. She turned her head slightly, her breath catching as she became fully aware of where she was. The hospital. Then she remembered everything. The stop. The voice of Officer Barnes, sharp and unforgiving. The roughness of his grip. The sudden, brutal force of his fist slamming into her abdomen. The way she had collapsed, gasping for breath, curling in on herself as pain had shot through her body in violent waves. The fear, overwhelming and paralyzing, that something had happened to the baby. Lisa exhaled shakily and let her gaze drift down to her stomach. Her hands trembled as she placed them gently over the curve of her belly. The warmth of her own touch grounded her, but she needed more. She needed to know for certain. A nurse entered the room, her steps quiet but purposeful. She was middle-aged, with soft eyes and a firm, professional demeanor. Seeing that Lisa was awake, she offered a small, reassuring smile. "You're in good hands," the nurse said gently. "The baby is strong. Heartbeat is steady. We're monitoring you closely, but so far, everything looks good." Lisa let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Relief flooded her, loosening the tight knot of fear that had been constricting her chest since the attack. She nodded, swallowing hard. "Thank you." The nurse checked the IV attached to Lisa's arm, adjusted the monitors, and made a note in the chart before glancing toward the door. "A detective was here earlier," she said. "He wants to speak with you when you're feeling up to it. He's handling the case." Lisa barely had the strength to think about legal matters right now, but she knew she couldn't ignore it. What had happened to her wasn't just a personal violation. It was something bigger, something that couldn't be allowed to happen again. She nodded faintly. "I'll talk to him." The nurse gave another reassuring smile before stepping out, leaving Lisa alone again. She took a deep breath, trying to calm the residual tremors in her hands. The events of the night played over in her mind like a film reel stuck on repeat. The moment Barnes had hit her. The impact. the air rushing out of her lungs, the sickening realization that she couldn't fight back. And then the man. Lisa's brows furrowed slightly as she thought of him, the stranger who had appeared out of nowhere, the man who had stopped Barnes in his tracks and taken control of the situation. At the time, everything had been a blur, but now, in the quiet of the hospital room, she could replay it more clearly. The way he had moved, precise, efficient, almost effortless. Not out of aggression, but out of necessity. He had been calm, in control, never hesitating, and then, after everything, he had simply walked away, letting the police take over without demanding recognition or explanation. She knew who he was now. She had heard his name spoken in whispers by the hospital staff, by the officers outside her door. Chuck Norris. A name she knew, but never expected to associate with her own life. He wasn't supposed to be a real person in her world, just a legend from movies, from jokes, from stories too exaggerated to believe. And yet, he had been there. A flesh and blood presence who had intervened when no one else had. Lisa swallowed. She owed him her gratitude, but more than that, she owed it to herself to ensure that what had happened to her would not be swept aside. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. A man in a dark suit stepped in, carrying a notepad and a worn expression. He was older, late 40s, with lines around his eyes that spoke of too many years dealing with cases just like this. He nodded at her. "Mrs. Hunt?" he asked, voice low but professional. Lisa shifted slightly, wincing as soreness flared through her abdomen. "Yes." "I'm Detective Harris. I'm handling the investigation into what happened last night." He pulled a chair closer to her bed, but didn't sit, studying her carefully. "I know you've been through a lot, but I need to ask you a few questions. Are you feeling up to it?" Lisa hesitated. She was exhausted. Every part of her ached, and all she wanted was to sleep, to pretend none of this had ever happened. But that wasn't an option. If she didn't speak now, if she didn't give her side of the story, she knew how this could end. She had seen too many cases where people like Barnes walked away unpunished because the victims were too broken to fight. So she nodded. Harris took out his notepad, flipping to a blank page. "Start from the beginning. Tell me everything you remember." Lisa took a breath, and then, slowly, she told him. She recounted the drive home, the moment the patrol car had appeared behind her. She described the way Barnes had approached her vehicle, the way he had refused to give her a reason for the stop, how he had ordered her out of the car with no explanation, his tone already aggressive. She spoke about the way he had grabbed her, his hand bruising her arm as he yanked her forward, the way he had struck her, his fist slamming into her stomach without hesitation. Her voice trembled slightly as she reached the part where she collapsed, her only thought being of the baby. She told Harris how she had been unable to breathe, unable to move, and how Barnes had stood over her, unmoved by what he had just done. Then she told him about the man who had stopped it. Harris listened intently, taking notes, nodding occasionally, but never interrupting. When she was finished, he looked up from his notepad. "There's a lot of footage circulating," he said. "Witnesses recorded parts of the incident. We also have security camera footage from a nearby residence. It confirms what you've said." Lisa exhaled, relieved. Harris hesitated. "Barnes is claiming you were resisting." Lisa let out a short, humorless laugh, shaking her head. "I could barely stand, let alone resist." "I believe you," Harris said, "but the department is already trying to control the damage. Barnes has been placed on administrative leave while the case is under review, But that's not the same as accountability. Lisa knew what that meant. They were protecting him, giving him time to prepare his defense, to twist the narrative in his favor. Her stomach twisted, anger rising beneath her exhaustion. "What can I do?" she asked. "Give a formal statement, press charges, and if you're willing, go public." Lisa's breath hitched. Going public meant turning her life into a battleground. It meant scrutiny, debate, people picking apart every detail of her past, questioning her actions instead of Barnes. It meant exposing herself to a fight she wasn't sure she had the strength for. But then she thought of the baby, of the moment Barnes had hit her without a second thought. And she knew. "I'll do it," she said. Harris nodded, closing his notepad. "All right, we'll make sure this gets handled the right way." He turned to leave, then paused. "And for what it's worth, you're not alone in this. A lot of people are behind you." Lisa swallowed past the lump in her throat. She nodded, but said nothing. As Harris left the room, Lisa lay back against the pillows, staring at the ceiling. She was terrified, but she wasn't broken. She had survived, and now she was ready to fight. Lisa sat upright in the hospital bed, her back pressed against the thin pillows, fingers tracing slow circles over the curve of her belly. The rhythmic beeping of the monitor beside her was a constant reminder that her baby was still there, still strong. But she knew better than to let relief consume her. The battle wasn't over. If anything, it was just beginning. The morning light seeped through the partially drawn blinds, casting pale streaks across the sterile white walls. Her body ached in a dull, lingering way, a reminder of every moment from the night before. The bruises on her arm, the soreness in her stomach, the phantom sensation of Barnes's fist slamming into her. She closed her eyes for a moment, willing the memories to settle, to fade even slightly, but they clung to her like damp fabric. Her phone sat on the bedside table, buzzing intermittently with messages she hadn't yet found the strength to check. The hospital staff had given her some space, but she knew it wouldn't last. The detective had made it clear. If she wanted justice, she had to act now. And that meant pressing charges, making a formal statement, and potentially stepping into a media storm that could change her life forever. She exhaled slowly and reached for her phone. The screen was flooded with notifications. Missed calls from her husband, texts from friends, news alerts from local channels. Hesitantly, she tapped one of the news articles. A video thumbnail filled the screen. It was the footage. The grainy, shaky clip that had already begun to spread. Her stomach clenched as she pressed play. The video began with a wide shot of her car parked on the curb, the flashing police lights illuminating the street. Barnes's towering frame came into view, his stance rigid, authoritative. Then the confrontation. His hand yanking her out of the car. The cruel swiftness of his fist as it struck her stomach. The way she collapsed, her body folding as she crumpled to the pavement. The person filming gasped audibly, their whispered exclamations of shock bleeding into the background noise. Then the video shifted. Another figure entered the frame, moving with controlled precision. The way he handled Barnes was almost surgical, as if he had predicted every move before it even happened. Lisa felt her breath hitch as she watched him take the officer down with a few swift, decisive movements. The clip ended before the ambulance arrived, but it was enough. She swallowed hard, staring at the screen. The comments were endless. Some filled with outrage, others trying to pick apart the footage, debating whether Barnes's actions were justified. And then there were the ones about him, the man who had intervened. Was that really Chuck Norris? No way. This is staged, Why was Chuck Norris even there? Lisa exhaled and set the phone down. The world was already reacting, and soon they would demand answers. A soft knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. She looked up as the nurse stepped in, followed by Detective Harris. He carried a folder under his arm, his expression unreadable. "Morning," he said, nodding. "How are you feeling?" Lisa hesitated, then answered honestly, "Sore, tired, angry." Harris pulled up the chair beside her bed. "That's understandable." He placed the folder on his lap. "Lisa, I won't waste time. Barnes has already been placed on administrative leave, but the department hasn't made any real moves against him yet. His lawyer's already spinning the usual defense. He acted in self-defense. He felt threatened. He didn't realize you were pregnant." Lisa's fingers curled into the bedsheets. "That's a lie." Harris nodded. "We know that. The footage makes it clear. But that doesn't mean this will be easy. Cases against officers, even with video evidence, rarely move quickly. The department is in damage control mode." He paused. "Which is why I need to ask, are you prepared to take this public?" Lisa swallowed. She knew what that meant. It wouldn't just be about Barnes anymore. It would be about her. Every mistake she'd ever made, every moment of her past, every detail of her life would be dissected. The media would look for any angle to shift the blame, and if the police union decided to back Barnes fully, the backlash could be brutal. But she also knew what happened if she stayed silent. She met Harris's gaze. "I won't let him get away with this." Harris's expression softened slightly, a flicker of approval in his eyes. He nodded and opened the folder, pulling out a document. "Then let's start with the official statement." Lisa spent the next hour recounting everything in detail. She repeated what she had told him the night before, but this time it felt different. He took her words down methodically, pausing only to clarify certain points. By the time they were done, her throat was dry, her hands trembling slightly from the weight of reliving it all again. When she signed the statement, Harris tucked it away and leaned forward slightly. "There's something else." Lisa looked at him warily. "Mr. Norris was questioned this morning," Harris continued. "He gave a full statement about what he witnessed. His version aligns with yours completely. He also made it clear he isn't seeking publicity. He just wants to make sure justice is served." Lisa felt a strange mix of gratitude and disbelief. Harris sighed and rubbed the back of his neck. "But because of who he is, this case is already bigger than anyone expected. The footage has gone viral. News stations are reaching out. Activists are picking up the story. If you move forward, it won't just be a local issue." Lisa hesitated. She had expected media attention, but she hadn't fully considered the scope of it. Would she be strong enough to handle it? Would she be able to protect herself and her baby from the storm that was about to follow? Then she thought of Barnes's fist, the coldness in his eyes, the way he had looked at her like she was nothing. Yes, she would handle it, because she didn't have a choice. She met Harris's gaze. "Let them talk. I'm not hiding." By the time Harris left, Lisa felt an exhaustion that ran deeper than just lack of sleep. She rested her head back against the pillow, staring at the ceiling. The hospital room felt too small now, too sterile. She wanted to go home. She wanted to feel safe again. But deep down, she knew there was no going back to how things were before. This was just the beginning, and she had to be ready for the fight. The hospital room had grown suffocating. Lisa sat in bed, staring at the blank television screen mounted on the opposite wall, her hands resting protectively over her belly. The soreness in her abdomen had dulled to a persistent ache, but the emotional weight pressing on her chest was only getting heavier. The detective had been right. The moment she agreed to go public, the world had grabbed onto her story with both hands, twisting it into something far larger than she had anticipated. She had barely slept the night before. Even with the hospital doors closed, even with the nurses whispering and shielding her from the worst of it, she could feel the outside world pressing in. Her phone had become a portal into a whirlwind of reactions, opinions, and scrutiny. Messages poured in from friends and strangers alike, words of support, of rage, of disbelief. But alongside them came the other messages. The ones that questioned her, that called her a liar, that accused her of provoking the attack. She had expected it. It didn't make it any easier. Her husband had finally arrived that morning, his face tight with exhaustion and worry. He had barely let go of her since stepping into the room, his hand clasping hers as if afraid she might disappear if he let go. He had been quiet at first, processing everything, watching the news reports, reading the headlines. Now, he stood near the window, arms crossed, staring out as if he could see the chaos unfolding beyond the hospital walls. "They're trying to control the narrative," he muttered. Lisa glanced at him. "I know." She had seen it happening in real time. The official police statement had been carefully worded, designed to leave room for doubt. The department had confirmed that Officer Barnes was under investigation but refused to acknowledge any wrongdoing on his part. Instead, they had subtly suggested that there was more to the story, implying that Lisa's actions had somehow warranted his use of force. Her hands curled into fists against the sheets. It was predictable, infuriatingly predictable. Then there was Barnes's legal team. They had wasted no time launching their own counterattack. His lawyer had made a statement that morning, standing outside the precinct speaking to a sea of reporters. The man had been smooth, measured, feigning sympathy while methodically planting seeds of doubt. "Officer Barnes deeply regrets that this incident has escalated to such an extent," he had said. "However, we stand by the fact that he followed protocol when he encountered a non-compliant suspect who refused to obey his lawful orders." Suspect. Lisa had nearly thrown her phone at the wall when she heard it. Her husband had taken it from her hands before she could do anything reckless. He had read the statement himself, his jaw tightening with each word. "This is how they do it," he had said, voice low with barely contained fury. "They twist reality, make it sound reasonable, make people doubt what they saw with their own eyes." It was working. The shift was already happening. News panels debated whether Barnes had overreacted or if his actions had been justified under the circumstances. Talking heads dissected every second of the footage, analyzing Lisa's body language, her reactions, the tone of her voice. Was she truly afraid, or was she overplaying it? Why hadn't she obeyed faster? Had she given him reason to believe she was a threat? A threat. Lisa exhaled through gritted teeth, forcing herself to remain calm. She couldn't let this consume her. She had given her statement. The evidence was on her side, and more than that, she wasn't alone in this fight. Outside the hospital, the protests had already begun. It had started with just a handful of people, neighbors, community members, local activists. By midday, the crowd had doubled, then tripled. They gathered outside the police department, outside City Hall, chanting for justice, demanding action. Lisa's name was on their signs. She had seen footage of the growing demonstrations, the aerial shots of the crowd swelling by the hour. It was surreal, watching strangers take up her cause, marching through the streets, refusing to let this be swept under the rug. But the larger it grew, the more the tension escalated. There had already been confrontations between protesters and police officers stationed outside the precinct. The footage was grainy, but it was clear enough. Officers in riot gear pushing back against the crowd, voices rising, tempers flaring. It wasn't just a case anymore. It was a movement. And Lisa was at the center of it. Her phone buzzed again. Another news alert. She ignored it. She had stopped reading them hours ago. A quiet knock at the door made her look up. A nurse peeked in, but her expression was hesitant, uncertain. "There's someone here to see you," she said. Lisa frowned. "Who?" The nurse hesitated. "Mr. Norris." Lisa blinked. For a second, she thought she had misheard. Then she saw him. The door opened fully, and he stepped inside. It was strange, seeing him in this setting, in this quiet, clinical room, far removed from the chaos of that night. He looked almost the same as he had then, calm, steady, unreadable. There was no arrogance in his stance, no expectation of gratitude, just quiet presence. Lisa's husband straightened, his expression shifting from surprise to something more guarded. "Lisa," Norris said, nodding slightly in greeting, "I wanted to check on you." Lisa wasn't sure what she had expected. Maybe for him to be more distant, more detached. But he spoke with a kind of simplicity that made it clear. He wasn't here as some larger-than-life figure. He was here as a man who had seen something wrong and had done what needed to be done. I'm all right," she said finally, though her voice wavered slightly. "Thanks to you." Norris shook his head slightly. "You shouldn't have needed me. This shouldn't have happened." Lisa swallowed hard. Her husband stepped forward, offering his hand. "I'm David Hunt," he said, "Lisa's husband." Norris took his hand firmly. "I know. I've read the reports." David nodded, glancing at Lisa. "They're turning this into a war." Norris sighed. "They always do." Lisa felt an odd comfort in the way he said it, not with bitterness, but with certainty, like someone who had seen it all before. "They want to make her the villain," David continued. "They want to bury this." "They won't," Norris said. It wasn't a promise exactly, just a fact. Lisa studied him. "Why did you come?" Norris met her gaze. "Because I know how this goes. And I know what it feels like to stand in the center of something like this." Lisa exhaled. The room was silent for a moment. Then Norris spoke again. "The protests will keep growing. The pressure will mount. They'll try to discredit you, and Barnes will fight this with everything he has." Lisa nodded. She already knew. "But you're not alone," he continued. "The world is watching now, and that means they can't hide this." Lisa looked down at her hands, then back at him. "I'm ready," she said. For the first time, Norris gave a small nod of approval. "Good," he said. And for the first time since that night, Lisa believed it. Lisa sat in the back seat of the car, staring out at the courthouse steps as the city buzzed around her. The crowd had already gathered, reporters setting up cameras, protesters waving signs, police officers standing in tense clusters along the sidewalk. The atmosphere was thick, electric, charged with the anticipation of what was about to unfold. David sat beside her, his fingers gripping her hand tightly. His presence was steady, grounding, but she could feel the tension coiled beneath his skin. Neither of them had slept much the night before. The trial was set to begin today, and no matter how much they had prepared, no matter how many times their lawyer had walked them through the process, nothing could fully brace her for what was coming. Chuck Norris had been right. The pressure had only intensified since she had decided to go public. The department had doubled down, defending Barnes with the full weight of their legal team, spinning a narrative that painted Lisa as an aggressive, uncooperative suspect. They had scoured her past, pulling up meaningless details in an effort to discredit her. An old parking ticket, a minor dispute with a neighbor years ago, anything they could use to shift the conversation. It was a tactic as old as time. When the system couldn't justify its actions, it tried to make the victim seem less innocent. Lisa had refused to engage with it. She had spoken only through her lawyer, through the formal channels, keeping her focus on the case itself. But that didn't mean it hadn't taken a toll. She had seen the comments, heard the talking heads debating whether she had escalated the situation, whether Barnes had been forced to act. It didn't matter that the video showed otherwise. It didn't matter that she had done nothing to provoke him. Doubt was a powerful weapon, and they were wielding it with precision. "Are you ready?" David's voice was low, steady, but she could hear the strain beneath it. She nodded, exhaling slowly. "I have to be." Their lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Rachel Connors, turned from the front seat, adjusting her glasses. "We go in, you sit beside me, and you say nothing unless I tell you otherwise. Let me do the talking. They will try to rattle you. They will try to make you emotional. Don't let them." Lisa swallowed and nodded again. She had learned quickly that the courtroom was not about truth. It was about performance. And today, she had to be prepared for anything. The car door opened, and the moment she stepped out, the noise crashed over her like a tidal wave. Reporters shouting questions, protesters chanting her name, camera flashes erupting in rapid succession. David's hand never left hers as they moved up the courthouse steps. The weight of the moment pressed down on her, but she kept walking, kept moving, because there was no other choice. Inside, the courtroom was cold, clinical, the walls a dull shade of beige, the wooden benches filled with spectators, journalists, and fellow officers watching the proceedings unfold. Lisa's pulse pounded in her ears as she took her seat beside Rachel, her hands clasped together in her lap. Then she saw him. Officer Barnes sat at the defendant's table, flanked by his attorneys. He looked different in a suit, stripped of his uniform and the authority it had once granted him. But his expression hadn't changed. There was no remorse in his eyes, no regret. Just the same cold, detached stare she remembered from that night. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. The prosecution began, laying out their case with precision. The video footage was played again, the courtroom bathed in the flickering images of that night. Lisa forced herself to watch, even as her stomach twisted at the sight of herself collapsing on the pavement. She wanted to look away, to pretend it wasn't her, but she wouldn't give them the satisfaction. The prosecutor's voice was firm. This is not a case of self-defense. This is not a case of resisting arrest. This is a case of an officer abusing his power, using unnecessary force against a pregnant woman who posed no threat to him. Lisa could feel the jury watching her, some with sympathy, some with skepticism. She had no way of knowing which way they would lean. Then it was the defense's turn. Barnes's lawyer stood, adjusting his suit with a practiced ease. He was polished, confident, the kind of man who had argued 100 cases just like this one and knew exactly how to frame his words. "This is an unfortunate misunderstanding," he began, his voice smooth. Officer Barnes had no way of knowing the extent of the situation he was dealing with. He was following protocol. When faced with a non-compliant suspect, an officer must make split-second decisions to ensure their safety and the safety of those around them. Lisa felt her nails dig into her palms. They were trying to make it sound reasonable, trying to make it seem like what had happened to her was just an accident, just a product of a high-stress situation. Then Barnes was called to testify. He walked to the stand with slow, deliberate steps, his face carefully composed. When he spoke, his voice was measured, his words carefully chosen. He talked about his years on the force, about the dangerous encounters he had faced before, about the split-second decisions he had to make in the field. "I was doing my job," he said. "I regret that it turned out this way, but in the moment, I believed I was acting within the scope of my duty." It was infuriating. Watching him sit there, lying with such ease, twisting the truth into something unrecognizable. But Lisa kept her face neutral, kept her breathing steady. She wouldn't give them what they wanted. Then it was Rachel's turn to question him. She stood, slowly flipping through her notes before looking up at him. "Officer Barnes," she said, her voice calm but pointed, "let's be very clear. At what point did Mrs. Hunt threaten you?" Barnes hesitated, just for a second, but it was enough. She was not following my instructions," he said. "Did she attack you?" "No." "Did she brandish a weapon?" "No." "Did she make any verbal threats?" He shifted slightly. "She was uncooperative." Rachel stepped forward. "And so you hit her? A pregnant woman?" The room was silent. Barnes's lawyer objected, but the damage had been done. By the time the court adjourned for the day, Lisa felt like she had been through a war, but she had seen something in the jury's eyes. A shift, a hesitation. She wasn't sure if it would be enough, but it was a start. As she stepped outside into the cool evening air, David wrapped an arm around her. "You did good," he murmured. Lisa exhaled. She wasn't sure she believed him, but she knew one thing. She wasn't backing down. The courthouse hall was unusually still. After days of crowded hearings, legal arguments, testimonies, and media frenzy, the silence was startling. Only the occasional whisper, the shuffle of papers, or the sound of a heel against polished marble floor broke the heavy stillness. Lisa sat beside her attorney in the front row of the courtroom, her hands folded tightly in her lap, every muscle in her body tense with anticipation. She had spent the night before lying awake in bed, her thoughts looping through everything that had brought her to this moment. She had prepared herself for disappointment, for the possibility that the jury would hesitate to convict a police officer. She had heard enough stories, read enough headlines to know how these cases usually ended. And yet, she couldn't help but hope. Rachel sat beside her, calm and poised, though Lisa knew her mind was racing just as much. Across the aisle, David sat with their legal assistant, a quiet, resolute expression on his face. He had been her anchor through the entire trial, absorbing every moment of testimony, every misleading statement from the defense, every tactic designed to undermine her. But today, he looked different, more guarded, as if bracing for something neither of them could control. Lisa's eyes drifted toward the defendant's table, where Barnes sat stone-faced, his uniform replaced with a tailored gray suit. The same unshakable air of entitlement surrounded him even now. His attorneys murmured quietly to each other, reviewing final notes and glancing at the clock as though the outcome were already decided. Lisa had grown accustomed to that look over the past several days, the confidence of men who had seen the system work in their favor more times than they could count. The judge entered promptly at 9, his black robe billowing as he took his seat behind the bench. The courtroom rose in unison, and Lisa followed the movement automatically, her legs stiff, her breath catching in her throat. When everyone sat again, the judge gave a brief nod. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" he asked. The foreperson, a middle-aged woman in a dark blue dress, stood slowly, her expression carefully neutral. She held a folded slip of paper in her hands, which she passed to the bailiff. Lisa watched the paper change hands, saw it delivered to the judge's bench. Her heart pounded. Every sound in the room seemed amplified. The rustle of the judge unfolding the paper, the faint creak of wood as someone shifted in their seat, the echo of the clock ticking on the wall. The judge read silently, then looked up. "In the case of the state versus Officer Robert Barnes," he said, his voice measured and firm, "on the charge of aggravated assault, the jury finds the defendant guilty." A ripple moved through the courtroom, murmurs of shock and approval, the hiss of a breath drawn too quickly, the sudden clearing of a throat. Lisa froze, her ears ringing, unsure if she had heard correctly, but the judge continued. "On the charge of official misconduct, the jury finds the defendant guilty." Lisa exhaled sharply, her vision blurring for a moment. Her entire body sagged in her chair. She felt Rachel's hand touch her shoulder briefly, a silent acknowledgement of what had just been achieved. Across the aisle, David leaned forward, elbows on his knees, blinking hard against the sting in his eyes. The relief was palpable, but it came laced with something else, a sense of awe that the truth had actually prevailed. Barnes didn't move. His face remained still, his eyes locked on the bench. But Lisa saw it, the tightening of his jaw, the slight tremor in his fingers, the way his attorney leaned in urgently, whispering something that didn't register. The confidence was gone now, replaced by disbelief. It was a look Lisa had waited to see. The judge raised a hand to quiet the murmurs before continuing. "Sentencing will be delivered in 48 hours. The defendant will be remanded to custody until that time." The gavel came down with a sharp crack. It echoed like a gunshot through the room, sealing the moment. Lisa didn't move for a long time. She sat in silence as the court slowly emptied around her, people filtering out in hushed conversation. The reporters were already leaving to file their stories, the protesters outside likely reacting in real time to the breaking news. But she remained still, unwilling to disturb the quiet moment of resolution that had taken root within her. For the first time in weeks, the tightness in her chest had eased. "You did it," Rachel said quietly. Lisa shook her head. "We did it." They exited the courtroom into a crowd of waiting cameras. The press conference had been planned in case of a verdict, and now the microphones were in place, the journalists shouting questions as they approached. Lisa's face was pale but resolute. David took her hand, and together they stood behind Rachel as she stepped forward to address the media. "The jury has spoken," Rachel said, her voice clear and unwavering. "This case was never about politics. It was about a public servant abusing his authority and assaulting a woman who posed no threat to him. Today's verdict confirms what the evidence made abundantly clear. Officer Barnes acted with unnecessary and unlawful force. We thank the jury for their courage, and we thank the people who stood behind Lisa when she chose to speak out." A reporter raised a hand. "Will you be pursuing civil charges as well?" Rachel glanced at Lisa. Lisa nodded once, then Rachel returned her attention to the press. "We're reviewing all options. For now, our focus remains on ensuring the court follows through with appropriate sentencing." Another question came. "Lisa, how do you feel now that justice has been served?" Lisa stepped forward slightly. Her voice was quiet but steady. "Relieved, grateful, Tired, but mostly I feel hopeful. This wasn't just about me. It was about everyone who's ever been hurt and told their pain didn't matter. Maybe now they'll know that it does. The cameras clicked furiously, capturing her expression, the calm after the storm. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Lisa returned home under the protective shadow of friends and neighbors, the street outside her house lined with signs of support, cards taped to the fence, bouquets of flowers on the porch, handmade posters from children down the block. The community had rallied around her in a way she hadn't anticipated, and, while it felt overwhelming, it also gave her a strength she hadn't known she possessed. She spent the evening curled on the couch, her feet propped up, David beside her, a hand resting lightly on her stomach. They didn't speak much. They didn't need to. The silence between them was full of meaning, of love, of shared resilience. The baby kicked once, then again, and Lisa smiled. 2 days later, they returned to the courtroom for sentencing. The atmosphere was markedly different. The media frenzy had dulled slightly, though reporters still lined the hallway. The crowd was quieter, more solemn, the gravity of what was about to occur settling in. Lisa wore a simple black dress, her hair pulled back, her expression composed. Barnes entered in handcuffs. There was no fanfare, no bravado, just the sound of shackles against his wrists, the click of polished shoes on the tile floor as he was led to the defendant's table. He looked smaller now, deflated, no longer the towering figure who had stood above her on that dark street. The judge reviewed the case briefly, reiterating the severity of Barnes's actions, the betrayal of public trust, the clear evidence that had led to his conviction. Then he paused, looking down at the defendant with an expression that was neither cruel nor soft. "You were given power," the judge said, "and you used it to harm, not because you had to, because you could. And in doing so, you not only hurt an innocent woman and endangered a child, you damaged the credibility of the institution you were sworn to uphold." A heavy silence settled over the room. "For the crime of aggravated assault, I sentence you to 3 years in state prison," the judge said. "For official misconduct, an additional 18 months to be served concurrently. This court recommends psychological evaluation and permanent dismissal from any future law enforcement roles." The gavel struck once more. Lisa's breath trembled as she exhaled. David gripped her hand tightly. Rachel gave a small nod beside her. It was over. As Barnes was led away, his face a mask of stunned disbelief, Lisa didn't feel triumph. She felt justice, not vengeance, not victory, just balance. A wrong had been acknowledged, a truth had been honored, and that, she realized, was enough. Outside, the crowd had gathered again. But this time it was quieter, less protest, more presence. People stood not in anger, but in solidarity. And as Lisa stepped out of the courthouse, walking beside David, she saw in their faces not just recognition, but belief. Belief that something had shifted. She had fought. She had been heard. And the world, even if only in this one instance, had listened. The weeks that followed the sentencing moved like a slow tide, gentle, steady, and transformative. In the quiet aftermath of the storm, Lisa found herself learning how to breathe again, how to move through each day without the weight of dread pressing down on her chest. For the first time in what felt like forever, the world outside her home no longer felt like a battleground. The courtroom had emptied, the headlines had begun to fade, and the cameras had finally stopped following her every move. The chaos had quieted, leaving behind the fragile beginnings of something new. She spent her mornings by the window, cradling a warm mug between her hands, watching the leaves turn golden in the early days of fall. The neighborhood, once shaken by the incident, now felt more connected than ever. Neighbors waved as they passed. Children from nearby houses stopped to place hand-drawn notes in the mailbox, brightly colored hearts and messages that read, "We love you, Lisa," or "You're a hero." She kept them all in a shoebox on the kitchen counter, unable to throw away even one. David had taken time off work after the sentencing. He moved through the house with the same quiet purpose he had shown during the trial, always checking in on her, always ready to listen. Their conversations were deeper now, more open, no longer burdened by the fear that once hung between every word. They talked about the baby constantly. Names, nursery colors, how to rearrange the guest room. There was laughter in the house again, soft and spontaneous, like rain after a drought. But the outside world had not forgotten her story. What had happened to Lisa had reached beyond their city, beyond the courthouse. News outlets across the country had covered the verdict, and advocacy groups had taken up her case as a rallying point for reform. The footage of Barnes's assault and his subsequent trial had been viewed millions of times, but more than that, it had sparked something. Town hall meetings, policy proposals, calls for independent oversight of police departments. Community leaders began reaching out to Lisa, asking if she would speak, if she would help bring her voice to the broader conversation. At first, she hesitated. She wasn't a politician or an activist. She had never imagined herself standing at a podium or sitting on panels. But every time she considered turning away from it, she thought of the night it all began. The cold pavement beneath her, the fear that had seized her chest, the silent pleas she had made to survive for the sake of her unborn child. She had been powerless that night, and now she wasn't. The first time she spoke in public was at a community forum held in a local high school auditorium. The room was packed with residents, police officers, students, and journalists. Lisa stood at the lectern, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted the microphone. But as she began to speak, the nerves gave way to something else. Clarity, strength. She didn't read from notes. She didn't prepare a speech. She just told the truth about what had happened, about what it had felt like, about the fear, the isolation, the fury, and about the hope that had followed. The audience had risen to their feet when she finished. Some clapped, others cried. And Lisa realized then that her story didn't belong only to her anymore. It belonged to every woman who had been silenced, every person who had been harmed by the system and told to endure it. Her voice had become a vessel for something greater than justice. It had become a call to change. From that point forward, she became a quiet leader in the growing movement. She attended meetings with local lawmakers, participated in workshops on police training reform, and spoke to youth groups about courage and resilience. Her story was no longer just a headline. It was a blueprint, a reason to believe that things could be different. Chuck Norris remained distant from the spotlight. He had made it clear from the beginning that he had no desire to capitalize on what had happened. But one afternoon, without fanfare, he stopped by her home. Lisa had been sitting on the front porch, her belly round and full, watching the sunset. David had just gone inside to answer a phone call. When she saw the familiar figure walking up the sidewalk, hands in the pockets of a weathered jacket, she stood slowly. "I figured I should check in," he said simply. Lisa smiled. "You saved my life." He shrugged, his eyes scanning the quiet street. You did the rest. They sat in silence for a moment, the warm evening air wrapping around them. There was no need for long conversation. Sometimes gratitude was best expressed in the spaces between words. Before he left, Chuck turned back and looked at her with a faint, thoughtful expression. You're going to raise a strong one, he said. Lisa watched him disappear down the sidewalk, her heart full. The days passed gently after that. Her due date drew closer, and each movement from within reminded her of how far she had come. The nursery was ready, a soft, serene space with pastel walls, a rocking chair, shelves lined with books and stuffed animals. She spent hours in that room, sitting quietly, imagining the life that was about to begin. When the contractions came, they came without warning, sharp and sudden. David rushed her to the hospital, his hands clenched on the steering wheel, voice calm despite the panic dancing in his eyes. It was early morning when they arrived, and the hospital staff, already familiar with her story, greeted her with kindness and urgency. The labor was long, exhausting, but when it was over, Lisa held her baby in her arms, tears streaming down her cheeks. A girl, healthy, beautiful, her skin soft and warm, her tiny hands grasping instinctively at the world she had just entered. They named her Maya. In the days that followed, the house filled with flowers and cards, meals delivered by neighbors, soft lullabies humming from the nursery. The world felt new, not because it had changed entirely, but because Lisa had. She had faced fear and violence, injustice and pain, and she had come through it with her head high and her heart intact. Maya grew quickly, her presence a reminder of everything that had been risked and everything that had been saved. As Lisa rocked her in the nursery late at night, she often whispered stories, not of fear, but of strength, of standing firm when the world tried to silence her, of the people who had lifted her when she fell, of the fight for truth and the long, winding path that had led to this peaceful room. David would join her sometimes, wrapping his arms around them both, humming softly, his voice full of warmth. They didn't talk about the trial often. It was part of them, always would be, but it no longer defined their lives. What mattered now was the future they were building. Lisa continued to speak publicly, but less frequently. She chose carefully when to use her voice, knowing now that silence could be powerful too. She worked with local organizations, helped draft new policies for police accountability, and mentored women who had experienced similar trauma. Her life was full, rich with purpose, and every so often, when the air was still and the stars hung quietly above their home, she would step out onto the porch, hold Maya close, and breathe in the peace she had fought so hard to find. She had been a victim once, but now she was something else entirely. She was a mother. She was a fighter. She was free. If you found this story powerful, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Check out the other videos on the channel for more. And if this message resonated with you, share the video. It might reach someone who needs it.